The umbilical parted with the most enormous bang, and instantly I tumbled down to the seabed and found myself in the most complete darkness, utterly disorientated, desperately groping, hoping to find the structure, to avoid walking out into no man's land, and knowing that I needed to get on top of the structure, otherwise the chances of my rescuers finding me were pretty much zero.
This is the story of one night in the North Sea, and how a diver found himself stranded 90 metres below the surface of the ocean without light, heat or gases to breathe, and almost no chance of survival. What happened to him and the incredible efforts of his colleagues to rescue him is an outrageous tale of triumph against all the odds in one of the most hostile environments on Earth.
I think globally speaking, you cannot have a worse situation than this. A ship totally out of control and uncontrollable. A lost diver with a limited amount of gas. I don't think there's ever been a diver lost and recovered for that length of time.
It was the 18th of September, and it was very much a normal day at the office, as much as it ever can be, I think, when you're diving in the North Sea. We were working on a sort of drilling template, which is essentially a great big structure under the water. It was very open, very easy access. Our umbilicals were very short, straight, and that day we were pressure testing, I think.
Basically, you see your A and B. We'll be opening and closing them in a sequence, and then doing a pressure test, and depending on what we get, we'll move on, right?
On that day, I was actually the bellman who stayed in the bell, didn't have to go diving. Chris and Dave were both on the job.
I think I was operating valves. We had Craig, our dive supervisor, in my ear giving me instructions.
It's almost bottomed out now, okay, Chris? So
I can talk to everybody. Other people can talk to other people through their different channels, but they can't override me. So I have ultimate command of talking to the bridge, the ROV, the deck crew, and the divers. We have a series of traffic lights in the bell. Green, normal diving. Amber, there is a problem, but the position still holds heading, and red is abandon. Dave, my fellow diver who was in the water with me at the time, he was just off doing another little job a few paces away from where I was. And then we heard the alarms.
We recognise the DP alarm, but when we hear it, it doesn't necessarily mean that we will run off and assume anything's gone wrong.
A dynamic positioning system is a system to keep the vessel in position, and to get that position set point we need reference system. The reference system we had on top us was GPSs, we had the TWTWR system, and the HIPAP system, that would be beacons or transponders on the seabed. In addition, to get the weather in, we have the wind sensors. We gave dive control the Amber Alert, and then we immediately went on the open communication, so they understood the urgency in this situation we got up on the bridge.
The way he said, we've got a problem on the bridge, I'm going Amber.
Go back on the stage.
You instantly knew that this wasn't a routine problem with the thruster. It was something catastrophic. I don't know why you know it, you just know it. So I said, go.
Craig was insisting that we get ourselves out of the manifold as quickly as possible, and you could just tell from his tone that this wasn't routine, this wasn't every day.
Back on the stage, please. Dave, leave everything there, Chris.
As they were heading back to the bell and coming up on their umbilicals, we had a red light. Red light is far more serious. It means we've actually started to lose position of the vessel.
But it happened so rapidly with the wind and the tide and the weather, you couldn't have comprehended the speed of how quickly the situation deteriorated.
The bell started just tipping slightly, which is a very unusual situation.
They had to get on top of a structure that I believe was 11 meters high, and they were working on the bottom. So I had to climb 11 meters and chase a ship that was going away from them from that face. So they had to go up 11 meters before they could start running after it. That was the issue for me.
When I reached the roof of the structure, I saw Chris's umbilical, and I could see that it was taut. At that point it wasn't tight, but it was taut.
I then saw that the chief officer and the captain were struggling to control the vessel and were actually had hands on the thrusters themselves, trying to turn the thrusters and keep position.
We were pretty much four meters away from the entrance of where the divers were, umbilicals were. Even by the time I managed to get the ROV turned to face the umbilicals and over to them, we were already getting pulled back off the structure.
The moment we got to the top, I realised that my umbilical, which had been, because it wasn't being pulled back by the bellman, I'd left a small loop behind me, and I turned instinctively to start pulling that up. And I spotted that it had caught on this transponder bucket, which is just a metal outcrop basically on the top of the structure.
Also, back to the stage, please. Chris, I want you back on the stage.
And I moved to free it, and it began to tighten. And at that moment, I knew straight away that I was in trouble. It tightened so fast, and it was completely immovable. It had jammed right under. Yeah, and I think I knew instantly then that this was serious.
Chris's umbilical started tightening very, very fast. I couldn't get any more off the umbilical rack. I couldn't even get my fingers in to get hold of it.
The pull of the umbilical actually pulled me off the top of the structure, and I ended up being pulled into it, almost straddling the top bar. My first response was that my legs were going to break. That was my first instinct.
The rack itself, which is made of stainless steel, started to creak and bend forward.
Instantly, I lost gas. It must have got to the point where the umbilical was so far stretched that it had tightened the gas line. Very instinctively, I put my hand to my head and I turned on the knob on my helmet, which opens the flow of gas from the bailout bottles which we carry on our backs in the event of an emergency.
The bell is actually now tipping over, probably about 20 degrees. It doesn't sound a lot, but when the water in the bottom starts tipping over, you can actually lose your bubble of air.
I could see Dave, he was trying to get back to me.
I still couldn't get to Chris. I was maybe 3 or 4 meters away from him, presumably because of the stretches in his umbilical, and his was a bit longer than mine.
Then Chris's umbilical went so tight that it actually bent the front of the stainless steel rack nearly off the wall to almost 90 degrees. And I had to jump onto the seat, or one of the seats, and almost Spider-Man myself to the wall, because I thought if this actually pulls itself off the wall, it could take me through the hole into the sea myself.
It's hard to imagine what Chris must have been thinking at that time. He's there with the line that connects him to life itself, trapped. He knows he can't get fresh gases into his hat. He can't get hot water into his suit. All the things that are trying to keep him alive, he can't get access to, and he knows immediately that this is going to be life-threatening. And so he's going to go through the whole range of fight or flight reflexes. His heart's going to be pounding. He's going to be breathing harder than usual. And all of this in probably the most extreme environment that this planet has to offer.
At that point we were facing each other. He was half over the bumper bar. He was looking, I think, at me.
I can almost remember him flailing his arms, trying to get to me to help me. I have a distinct memory of sort of looking him in the eyes almost, and watching him be pulled away from me as the ship moved away.
And then suddenly there was a very, very loud bang, almost like a shot. And then the tension was taken off.
I think when the umbilical snapped, because it was a very violent and noisy thing to happen, the adrenaline instantly kicked in. It instantly felt dangerous. It almost looked like a part of a film to see the light going out and being dragged away from him.
Almost dramatically got pulled backwards and faded away into the darkness, and I never saw him again. Yeah.
Of all the moments that I think back to, that's the one that tends to stick with me.
And then I fell back towards the seabed, and it was just the most complete and absolute darkness.
After the light went out, I was immediately being pulled away from the structure. I knew at that point that there was nothing that I could do for Chris. I was partly thinking, I'm glad that wasn't me. I don't think it was an emotional response. It was a survival instinct about getting back to the bell and getting back to safety.
Chris's umbilical parted. We knew it parted. I knew it parted because his screen went dead. His comms went dead, and the bell comms, I believe, went dead at the same time because we had a short circuit.
We seemed to lose communication with the supervisor at this point because of Chris's umbilical breaking. I was still shouting to him that we're canted over at an angle.
It was a 50-metre climb. I climbed hand over hand back to the bell. I knew that there were other structures down there that I could potentially get caught up in. My primary concern was getting back to the bell in one piece.
When the boat stopped moving off station, Dave's umbilical became slack again, and he could pull himself back up his umbilical and got onto the stage.
I was very aware that as I climbed up my umbilical, I was leaving a large loop of umbilical behind me. When I got back there, because the boat had twisted a couple of times, the umbilical had actually gone round the bell. So I had to climb around the outside of the bell before Duncan could come up on my umbilical. By the time I got there, I was exhausted.
I pulled Chris's umbilical in during the time we were still moving sideways, because it obviously had no weight on. All the time I'm pulling it in, I know that something's drastically wrong, because pulling a fully kitted diver in is normally some feet, and you do have to really put your effort in to pull it in, because I was just pulling in an empty hose.
I wanted the umbilical back in the bell because as soon as we got his umbilical, at least we know that he has some integrity in his helmet. If we had a helmet back in the bell, that wouldn't have been a good scenario.
The worst bit for me for the whole thing was when I actually pulled in the broken end of his umbilical, because obviously it's broken in different places. It wasn't a clean break, and I pulled in his hot water hose, which is still spewing water off, so I had to turn that off. And then I pulled in his gas hose, which is still spewing gas out, so I'd had to turn that off. And at that point I actually felt physically sick. I could have literally chucked up in the bell then, because I knew that Chris was out there on his own with nothing, no backup, anything. And we were not on station, obviously, which is why the bell had been tipping over.
The bailout was only designed to be used for a very small period of time. I think it is 1 minute for every 10 metres of umbilical, as a minimum. We had 50-metre umbilicals, so Chris's bailout, by law, only had to last for 5 minutes. I knew that it took at least 5 minutes for me to get back to the bell, so I assumed that if Chris had survived the initial incident, at that point he would have run out of gas and he would be hypothermic from the loss of hot water.
What I was aware of, first of all, was the nothingness. There was I was desperately looking around for the diving bell for safety, and there was nothing. There was no light, not a speck of light in the sea above me. And at that point, I probably had the first dose of good fortune of many, in that I bumped straight into I think it was a leg of this structure. I could very easily have turned the other way and walked out into the wilderness almost, but I then knew where I was. I couldn't swim back up because the air supply to my buoyancy jacket, which we'd normally inflate to get us off the seabed, had been severed along with my umbilical.
And so now Chris faces this huge dilemma because the bailout bottle that he's using has only a few minutes of supply. He's aware of that, and he wants to do everything he can to make that spin out as long as possible. And that means exerting himself as little as possible. And he knows that his best chance lies on the platform above him and in climbing up to find that platform to give his teammates the best chance of locating him.
So in order to get back on the structure, I needed to find a way to climb up. So whilst maintaining contact with the structure so I wouldn't lose it, I edged my way along, and I bumped into the pressure testing downline, which is a 2-inch hose which came from the ship, which was lying across the top of the manifold, and I was able to grab hold of this and climb up. It was completely through feel. I was totally blinded. Yeah, there was no way of being sure what it was even, but I knew very quickly that all I could do was sit still and wait. The overriding thought was, I've got very, very little gas left here. When you think about your bailout bottle, it's designed to give you just enough gas really to get back to the bell, usually when you set off straight away, and I'd already used a fair bit up. So in my mind, it was a clock that was ticking, and it was ticking down fast.
Chris must have realised that help, if it arrived at all, was going to arrive too late. He must have had a sense of that. He probably had worked it out in his head. And so for him, having done everything that he could, he must have realised that this was the end. And yet he's in this unique place with the burden of time to contemplate that. In the pitch black on his own, to have those thoughts running through his head. And that, I think, must have been, well, I can't think that, it's unimaginable.
I'd love to say that I was in complete control of all my faculties, but and that I'm a model diver and all that. But I can tell you right now, I was panicking. There's no doubt about it. I perhaps wasn't screaming and shouting and running wildly around, but yeah, there's a dreadful fear in you and a dreadful panic. Yeah. I have very distinct memories of calling Duncan's name, and Duncan was in the bell. It wouldn't have been him coming to rescue me anyway, but for some reason it was him I thought of, and I think I can actually remember calling his name out and almost pleading for him to arrive and sort of save me. I maybe cursed a few times as well. Cursed my luck, you know. You obviously get selfish in these situations, you know. Why me? And what a good awful place to die. I was very, very much aware that the chances were very, very slim. Once I think I'd managed to control my breathing, my thoughts were of mostly disbelief, I think. It was such a shock to be in that situation, and I thought a lot about my fiancée at the time. I thought about the house I was in the middle of building. I don't, for example, remember thinking I'm not going to see my mother again, you know. Obviously I love very much, and it would have been devastating, but that didn't cross my mind, you know. I think it's more a general sense that your future is about to be robbed. Nothing explicit in terms of I won't have the 2 daughters I want and all the rest of it, but that I'm about to lose the chance of everything. Yeah. I think it's rare to get that opportunity to reflect on your impending death, because I think at that point that's where, certainly psychologically, I just didn't think there was much chance of my getting out of this. So your thoughts turn to the people you love, obviously, and the things you're going to leave behind, and the devastation you're going to leave behind. With regards to my fiancée, I remember apologising to her. I think that's the one thing I did shout out many times. I just remember shouting, I'm so sorry, Morag, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for sort of putting myself in that position, for being selfish in many ways. So yeah, I was just apologetic, and That's my nature anyway. Yeah, and of the carnage you're going to leave behind, yeah.
As the bailout bottle empties and his oxygen supply fails, he's in trouble. He's in trouble because he has no more oxygen, but also because he can no longer get rid of the waste gases that he's breathing out, and so the carbon dioxide is rising in the helmet. And that has an important effect on the body. Most of the reason that you choose to breathe is associated with how much carbon dioxide your body senses, and particularly how much it senses in your bloodstream. And so as he's re-breathing these waste gases, his body is telling him to breathe harder just at that time when actually he has no fresh supply of gas. And that's going to be an awful, panic-inducing sensation.
Towards the end, I remember basically just being so constantly surprised that I was still breathing. It seemed to last a lot longer than I thought it would. But then eventually, I did start to sense when you start to run out of gas in your bailouts, it starts to tighten. It becomes a little bit harder to breathe. And I think at that point, I don't remember it explicitly, but I do remember thinking, here we go, this is it. I hope it doesn't hurt, I think. And after that, nothing, yeah. I've often described it as you went to sleep last night, but you probably don't remember the moment it actually happened, and I think it was very similar to that. I can remember the breathing getting harder, but I don't remember slipping into unconsciousness.
Chris's part in this is now essentially over. He's unconscious, and he's unconscious because he's been suffocated by the carbon dioxide rising in his helmet. Those gases, those waste gases that he's breathed out, are accumulating inside his helmet, and the oxygen supply is dwindling. And that's what's going to kill him. That's what's going to kill him. But there is another threat, and that's the threat of the extreme cold. And that too is making an attempt on his life. It's slowing down the cellular processes in his body, all of those tiny mechanisms that together are Chris's life, are trying to grind to a halt. And while that's a massive threat to him, it has a strangely beneficial effect. It takes his life and the moment of his death and it smears it out over a much longer period of time. And for Chris, I think that's an important part of his survival.
We started getting some information back from Craig from the surface that we'd had a runoff. The computer systems on the boat had gone down.
They had a system where they had, I think, 10 sources of information. If one failed, the other 9 would provide the information. But they all failed at once. It can't happen. It just cannot happen. You have to believe the impossible can happen to try and, all right, move on. They took some time to understand the impossible that happened, to move on to, right, what can we do? We can go manual.
There was a bit of chaos on the bridge. There was the DP officer, the chief officer and the captain were trying to drive the vessel manually. I asked them what was going on. Obviously they were very busy. They had total loss of DP. They couldn't control the DP even on the manual joystick. So they have to actually operate the thrusters directly with hand themselves, which was something I'd never seen before, to be honest.
We tried to do a reset of the dynamic position system, meaning we went from manual control to DP, dynamic position control again. We did that 2 or 3 times, that didn't work. The next natural step will be to go to the independent joystick, but then nobody can confirm that that system was not affected by the fault we got on the dynamic positioning system. So then we went straight to manual control because we knew all the levers and everything that was operational.
ROV, can you try and find my diver, please?
For 20 minutes or so, we couldn't get the ROV on the job. We didn't really know what the scenario was unfolding. We knew that we were a long way away from Chris. The mathematics and the physics were against him in the length of time he had in his bailout. I calculated at the time maybe 9 to 10 minutes, depending on how quickly he breathed.
Luckily, close to that point, the DP came back online and we managed to get control of the vessel again on the auto DP.
The idea that we wouldn't go get Chris entered no one's scenarios. We were going to pick up Chris regardless. we didn't want to be defined by this. And I knew I wasn't going to be defined by this. I wasn't going to be the supervisor who lost the diver. And Dave wasn't going to be the diver who couldn't rescue the diver.
The surveyor told me that he'd found the signal responding off the beacon. We ascertained that it was off diver 2. So we knew by ascertaining that we had a good idea of where the position of the diver was.
I just kept giving them range and bearings and encouraging the divers, especially Dave, to be patient. We are on our way back. We are making progress, even though we weren't.
We got some good positive feedback from Craig from the surface, saying that we were obviously going into a rescue mode. We were going back to fetch Chris. At no point did he say recovery.
When we got closer and closer and closer, the ROV was in range to go locate Chris.
As soon as we got level with the top of the structure, we could see the diver lying in the middle of the structure.
Chris was actually on top of the template, was exactly where he should have been, but we didn't know that until we got there. He could have been somewhere very close to the template. He could have been on the seabed.
Basically just flew around checking that he was all right. Checked his umbilical, made sure his umbilical wasn't trapped, so it was free.
It was great to see Chris, although he was lying prone. And although we saw that his helmet was intact, there was a concern of the fact that he was not moving. He was twitching, he was maybe moving in the side, but he wasn't actually responding. It was reflex. It wasn't anything conscious. And we spent many, many minutes watching him, unable to help him.
I've never been in a situation before where I've had a diver on the seabed with a severed umbilical. The vessel's 190 meters away, and he's there without any assistance for approximately 36 minutes.
Seeing him lying in the middle of the structure was very scary, and when we were sitting watching him, you could see the water line, the sickness feeling in your stomach, and seeing him lying there twitching away and not knowing if he was okay or not. It was probably one of the worst experiences of my life.
I thought Chris had been killed then.
There was some discussion between the ROV and the dive control about if it would be possible to get hold of Chris with the ROV and bring him to the bell as opposed to bringing the bell to him, because we didn't know if we could get control of the vessel at that time to get back.
At one stage we did get asked if we could pick him up and take him up to the bell. At that point I made the decision that it wasn't part of our procedures. We weren't trained in doing it, and there was pretty much nowhere that we could safely pick him up and take him to the bell. Also, with having 250 meters of tether spilled out on the seabed, not knowing where it is, we might have not even made it back to the bell with him, you know, or dropped him, or anything could have happened.
The bell, you know, is our safe haven. If we drag it along the structure, then we have serious issues. At the same time, we had to rescue Chris. That's why I wanted the divers on top of the structure, because then at least we're not dragging the bell lower than the structures. Our cardinal rule in diving is to be 5 meters above the highest structure, so we can never touch it. We were going to break that rule by going as close as we could, kissing it if you want, when we got back there. But that would help Dave because of lifting up a dead weight, if you want.
By the time we got back to the structure to rescue him, they were having to tell Dave not to jump off until the boat was stable in its new position back over the structure, back over the top of Chris.
I think Craig was aware that I was keen to leave the stage to get to Chris, and he told me that not to leave until he told me to.
To get everything ready is normal procedure. It's we do practice drills, and we actually do diver rescues and bring him back into the bell. So that is all standard form. But actually, you never actually think you're going to need it.
I think I treated recovering Chris the same way as I would have treated recovering an inanimate object from the seabed. I think that helped me to not think that I was recovering my colleague or a dead body or my friend. I recovered an object from the seabed.
Well, anyone's going to be emotional in this state. I wasn't emotional. I don't know why. I don't know where you get that strength or power or whatever. But I knew that Dave was keen to save Chris.
Earlier in the year, he'd come to my house with his wife for a party, and so I knew he was going to get married shortly. There was no way I was not going to let him get to that wedding. So, no, we were going to rescue him and make sure he was okay.
When I got to Chris, the first thing I did was to have a quick look at him. I don't think the water was covering his nose and mouth, but there was certainly a water line in the helmet. That he was not moving, he was not visibly breathing, he was lying on his front. The first thing that I did before I lifted him was to put my pneumo into his neck dam, giving him a gas supply. I then put him upright and tried to hold him upright as best I could to keep the gas in the hat. I think I then clipped my rescue lanyard onto his harness and I started to come up on what remained of his umbilical. I knew that his umbilical had been trapped. I thought maybe it was still trapped, and I just made sure by coming up on the end of his umbilical. I asked Craig to get my umbilical pulled up as tight as I could, and I started climbing my umbilical, dragging Chris below and behind me. As the bell came down, his body was getting forced underneath the grating at the bottom of the bell, and I had a fair bit of trouble pulling him over that. Once I got the diver recovery hoist onto him and asked Duncan to come up, he slipped into the trunking fairly easily, and at that point, more than anything, I felt relief that my job was done, and I was handing over to Duncan.
Once he got him clipped onto the Mazdam, I can control Chris's weight, and all Dave then has to do is point him in the right direction and make sure he doesn't get caught coming up through the bell trunking. Once I had Chris securely on the Mazdam and his head inside the bell, Dave outside can't get in the bell, there's not enough room. Chris's body and his bailout's taking up the whole trunking, so he just has to wait then.
All I can see is a pair of legs dangling out the bottom of the bell. I know that at that point there's nothing that I can do. I wasn't holding onto any hope that he would have survived it. He was a dead weight, he looked like a dead body.
With him being unconscious, he had no reflex to hold his head up, and the diving helmet weighs 17 kilos.
Duncan took his hat off. We couldn't see in the camera.
His whole head, his ears, his lips, his nose was bright blue. I've seen cyanosis before, but only in lips and ears, and it was actually quite striking. Also, the reflex with his head lolling was still unbelievable. I had to keep his head up, which for Chris with no hair, you just had to put your hand on the top of his head like a billiard ball. I gave him 2 rescue breaths.
I said, how is he? He says, he's breathing.
He made a noise and started breathing straight immediately.
So we knew he was safe. For a moment, we knew he was safe. He was alive.
The fact that he gets into the bell and is still breathing is is itself unbelievable, unbelievable. But the fight's not over there. It doesn't stop there. When you resuscitate people in hospital, you know that you can have these critical situations. You know you can restore someone to just be breathing and still lose. You can still lose because they have such horrible brain damage from starvation of oxygen. And so even at this point, they're not out of the woods.
Camera's back. ROV, can you just swing the bell, please?
I didn't believe that what Chris had gone through was survivable.
Chris started to regain consciousness. He seemed to recognise what I was asking him to do, and he did manage to climb up the ladder himself and sat down on his normal seat. The only thing is he did want to take off both Mazdam harnesses straight away, which is something that you would do after a dive. You take your gear off, and I had to to convince him to stay sat in the seat, sit still. I was telling him he'd had an accident, he'd been out, he'd been rescued.
I was confused that Chris was okay. I almost wasn't expecting to see him when I got back into the Bell. He looked half the man that went diving at the beginning of the day.
As soon as we got that door seal on, we plugged Chris back into his hot water system.
You guys, I've still got the hot water running full pelt if you want to dose Chris down, if he's cold. Just on the outside of him, right? Nothing too major, just...
Kept him on the Mazdams just in case he did go unconscious again, and we're asking him questions now which he is actually able to answer. Every time that he actually spoke, answered a question, it was just over the moon.
I have a distinct memory of us being on our way back, and I can remember at that point reaching over and grabbing Duncan's hand, you know, and giving it a squeeze. So I'd obviously at that point I knew something had happened. What I can also remember is looking over and seeing Dave crumpled in the corner, exhausted, and not really understanding why.
Bridge, it's about on the surface, 19.
I think possibly when I got back into the Bell, I was maybe a little bit cross with Chris in the way you would be as a father when your child wanders off and you can't find them. You're relieved to see them, but also you're angry with them for having put you through the trauma.
All right. Dave, I'll come and talk to you later. Thanks for your help. Yep.
Chris went down the ladder himself, which again was a massive feat for him, after being unconscious less than 20 minutes ago.
I can remember climbing down into the system, and being met by sort of a reception committee of divers.
2 diver medics came through from the chamber they were going to take him to, and stripped him off, towelled him down, wrapped him up in 3 or 4 duvets.
Despite the must be many thousands of pounds of medical equipment we have locked away in that chamber, probably the most important bit of kit they used was the tea cosy they put on my head to keep me warm.
It was an exceedingly dirty white tea cosy with flowers on it that we use all the time to keep our teapots warm, and they took it straight off a pot and put it on his head still warm, so it obviously did the trick.
There was a lot of hugging and and well dones, you know, and a lot of thanks to Dave and Duncan, and a lot of recounting the story to a lot of curious colleagues.
The next thing I won't actually forget, because when they locked on the Bell, we had the diver. He got out of the Bell and he looked at the camera and just waved, and that was a really good feeling for us up on the bridge.
He was monitored the rest of the night, and once we'd established that Chris was okay, and there was nothing else we could do, we left the site and I instructed the vessel to go straight to Aberdeen.
The outcome of the incident was great relief, of course. I remember going on board on the Saturday and seeing Chris Lemons for the first time, and I'm not usually in the habit of hugging our divers, but I must admit I did give him a quick grab and a squeeze there. Somebody said, well, you've been really lucky, but I disagree. I think that the guys on board made their own luck that night.
Christopher was obviously desperately trying to get a hold of me. to let me know what was happening, because he had been told that the newspapers were being informed, and he had to let me know prior to them either getting the wrong end of the stick, getting the wrong story, or such a small village that we live in that someone else were to turn around and say, "Oh my goodness, Morag, is Christopher all right? What's happened?" He began to tell me the story of this diver and how this had happened, and you know, I listened to the story sitting in my classroom on my own, and eventually we got to the end of the story and I said, "Christopher, who did this happen to?" And he said, "It was me." And I didn't know what to do, just total shock. Total shock. It was awful. I just looked for someone to talk to. Sorry, I'm getting upset.
In truth, I came out of this whole experience in many ways more confident and happy with what I do for a living. So for us, there was never any question of not going back, and I really hope I continue to do this for many years.
When the boat had been repaired and extensively tested, it was very important to Bibby and for us to get back onto the boat, get back onto the horse, as it were, straight away. We did have a bit of a laugh and a joke about it, but we were all very serious going into the dive, and quite relieved possibly when it had all finished. We had no run-offs, there were no problems whatsoever. It was just another day, and we all came back safely.
Prior to this incident, Bibby Offshore was a participant in this business in diving in the North Sea. But as a result of this incident, we are absolutely leading diver safety nowadays. We want to make sure that we do everything that we possibly can to learn from this incident, and as a result, make sure that the risks that the divers are exposed to are as low as possible.
Life for me, well, life goes on as it does. I still have to clean the fridge out on a Tuesday and put the bins out on a Wednesday, and life continues as normal. We've finished building our house since, which has been a real pleasure. So I got to see the end of it after all.
We did make it to the wedding, and he massively embarrassed me when, at the end of his speech, he mentioned, obviously, what had happened, and pointed me out as to who it was that had revived him in the bell. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't get away from the bar. I never bought a drink. I hardly saw my wife because everybody just wanted to come and shake me hand, pat me on the back and buy me a whiskey.
And then, yeah, we subsequently got married, I think the following April, which was, you know, best day of my life, as it should be. So life's been extremely good since, yeah. People say very kind things about what I've done, but in truth, in this whole situation, I was simply the damsel in distress. And I've always been very conscious that whilst people want to talk to me, the truth is that they were the heroes of this story.